I'm Alex Peachey. I work for Originate. I'm going to talk about ActiveNull, a library that I wrote. First thing I want to talk about is the null object pattern, which is what the library was based off of. And so you kind of need to know a little bit about that before I tell you anything about the library, otherwise it won't make a whole lot of sense. Basically what the null object pattern is you create an object that has the same interface as another object, but with neutral or null behavior for any kind of interaction with it. And it's an instance of the special case pattern. So the idea being that whenever you have a special case of a null object, then you can stand in this other object. So when should we use it? In Ruby, you should use it when your method might receive a nil, and the presence of nil is a special case, and the handling of the special case is to do nothing. So instead of sending nil into your method, always send it a real object. That object might be a null object though, and then you can treat it just like it's the regular object. There's a gem called not out there, and it's a toolkit for building null objects in Ruby. It was written by Avdi Grimm, who also wrote the book Confident Ruby, which you should all read if you haven't yet. And in there he talks about null objects and the pattern of using them. And after he did that, he realized it might be very nice to have a way to create null objects in Ruby in a nice way. And he actually kept track of what he was doing as he created it and captured that in Much Ado About Not, which is another book that he has published. And that one's really interesting because if you find metaprogramming interesting at all, he basically walks through his thought process on how to create all of this metaprogramming that is used to create this library that creates null objects. And it uses the builder pattern in the library to create the null objects. And that includes an extensive DSL, so you can customize your null objects in a whole variety of ways to build up these classes that you can then instantiate to have a null version of whatever object you want. So you can look into that a little bit more. The reason I bring that up is that I built my gem using his. So this is an example, it's a very simple example of using the not gem. You can create a null logger, and so you say not.build, and build takes a block. I'm not using the block form here. Without a block, it just gives you a very basic null object class, and then you can new it up. And so you can say no logger.new and grab a logger. And anywhere where you normally have a logger, you could, if you want, stick a no logger in there, and any message that you send to it, like info, will just get ignored. It'll just vaporize. It doesn't do anything and it returns nil. So the null object, which is supposed to be used instead of nil, has methods on it which will return nil. But that's okay because the idea is you're going to be just generating these objects that would then be exercised by some other class, and they're going to know how to react to getting a nil out of the object they're interacting with, or they may not even be looking at the return value if they're giving it a command to do something like sending the info message to the logger saying log this as an info message. So the ActiveNull gem, what this does is it kind of fixes Rails so that, and Active Record specifically, so that you can not get so many nils flying around. Active Record loves to give you nils in a lot of different places, and it's not very useful because then you end up having to check all the time whether you have a real thing that you were hoping for or nil. And so what this does is it allows Active Record objects to emit null object versions of themselves in appropriate circumstances. And as I said, I built it using the not gem, and it's easy to use by just extending your models with the ActiveNull module. And it works really well if you combine it with other gems like Draper. So you can make your views a lot cleaner by assuming that you always have a decorated object that might be a null object, but you just always send it what you want to have it do, and the null version will just not do anything most of the time, or might give an appropriate message that might be displayed that there might be some kind of issue or problem going on. And you don't need ifs checks to make sure that you actually have an object laying around all over your view code. So here's an example. So I've got post and a comment. So it's just a standard model that subclass is active record base. And all I've done is I added extend ActiveNull into both of these. And post has many comments, and a comment belongs to post. So it's a pretty standard relationship that you might find in your classic Rails blog. And then when you use it, the class post has a new class level method on it called null. And if you call null, which you wouldn't do most of the time, but it's there. And so if you call it, you get a null version of post. You get a null post. And if you do find by, and whatever the criteria is in the find by, it doesn't really matter. If find by returns nil, instead of returning nil, it will give you a null version of the object. So you'll get a null post back instead of nil. If you then, so I captured that in post. So I did a find by, I didn't actually get a real one, I got a null one. If I then ask that post for its comments, I get an empty active record relation that is a true active record relation, but it is a sinkhole one. So no matter how many things you chain onto it, you'll always just get it evaluated to an empty array. So that means you can safely just say post.comments and even iterate over the comments, of which there won't be any, and it'll all just work. So even if you map it or each or whatever, it'll just, your code won't break, it'll just work like you hope it would. If you give it some other command, like say post.save, it returns nil, which is a falsy value in Rails. And so if you have any kind of situation where you say, find something, maybe change it a bit, and then save it, and you have your classic block, if post.save, then do something else, this is a failure case, and you can act appropriately because you failed to save. Why you failed to save, it's up to you then to further figure that out. It might be because you have a null post on your hands, or it might be because there's some errors on there that are sitting around. If you create up a new, it was easiest to show by creating a new comment, but this could be any actual comment that you find. If it doesn't actually have an associated post, if you say comment.post, then you get a null post. So because it's got that belongs to relation there, you're going to get a null version of that if that ID, so if post ID on comment is nil, then instead of giving you nil for post, it's going to give you a null post, which is much more useful. In your views, as I mentioned, if you work with Draper, you can do some pretty cool things. So in your application controller, assuming you have a current user that's maybe provided to you by Devise or some other library, or if you rolled your own, you can obviously change it up. But the easiest thing to do here is just to take your current user that's already there from some library, say super or user.null.decorate. And so what that'll do then is you'll either get the actual current user if there is one, or it'll grab a null version of the user and decorate it up. Because the library is Draper aware, then it understands that if it has a null user, it will use the null user decorator when you say .decorate on it. So no matter which one you get, you're either going to get a user or a null user, and you'll either use the user decorator or the null user decorator. So here, I have a method called session controls, and on the user decorator, it will render a partial called sign out, and on the null user, it'll render a partial called sign in. And then in my view, maybe in the header, I can say current user.session controls. And I don't have to care if there is a user or not. It doesn't matter. it'll just put the appropriate controls there. It'll either render out a partial containing a sign in button or a sign out button. So that's pretty cool that it allows you to simplify your views down like that. And really, that's about it. I went as fast as I could for you, Jeremy, because I wanted to make sure we get through this. I can show you guys the actual spot on GitHub where this is. Also, I want to reiterate again, at least read Confident Ruby. You don't have to read much ado about not. It is kind of interesting and fun, but you'll be a much better Ruby programmer if you read Confident Ruby. So check it out if you haven't already. And on the library here, I just wanted to show real quick the null model builder, which is what actually builds these using the not library. So here's what not allows you to do. You can basically say not.build, and this time I'm giving it a block, and I tell it to impersonate the model class that I'm working with here. So this might be post or comment. And what impersonate does is it basically makes it so that my null object responds to every method that the post model responds to, but not other ones. So if post doesn't respond to foo, you'll get a no method error if you send foo to a null post. But if post has comments, which it does, then it'll act appropriately. So impersonate's pretty cool there. It also has a version called mimic, which will go a step further and make the null object claim to be of the same class as the real object. But I specifically don't want that behavior here because, again, we want to be able to decorate and have it be smart about, is it a null version or not? So I use impersonate instead of mimic there. And then we reflect on all of our associations, and we define a method up based on whether it's a collection association or if it's a belongs to or a has one or something like that. So if it's a relation collection, we give it this association called .none. So at Rails, I think it started in Rails 4. I don't think it's a Rails 4.1 thing. You can say .none, and it'll do a short circuit relation. And then if it's a belongs to or a has one or something like that, then we just do a null version of whatever the class is that it's related to. And for every single column on our class, because you can have default values on columns, it goes through and basically defines a method for it that returns the default. So even though the null object will by default just have the methods that are on there and null them out, this goes a little bit step further and says if there was a default on this column, it makes sense that the null version would have the default because that's the default on any of these type of things. And we just have an answer to a few other things in case you do want to interrogate it and figure out what it is. So it says, it claims it's nil if you ask it if it's nil. It claims it's not present. It claims it's blank. And its to.json is an empty object. And then here's some stuff where we hook in and do some funky stuff to make sure it's decoratable by Draper. And we also have some extra functionality if you want to give it additional methods that maybe either you want to act separately on an object or not. So for example, if I go back here, there's an example of this down here. So null model takes a block. So it's a class level macro that you can put on here. And you can just put additional methods on there. That can be override methods. So if you want to override a method that's on the standard one, or if you want to just give it some special method all on its own, you probably wouldn't do that because for the most point you want to mimic the interface. But there may be some case where you really want the value. You might have like a quantity or something on there that you don't want it to come out as nil or something, and you want it to come out as 0 so that your math automatically works appropriately or something like that. So that works pretty nicely. And that's kind of a walkthrough of how it works and how it was made and how to use null objects that hopefully you'll all toss into your project and start coding more confidently. Are there any questions about anything I covered?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah, what's your question, Jeremy?
I recently wrote a gem where I'm using the null object pattern, but while going through it, I kind of questioned like when would it be better to use a null object versus just raising an exception?
Right. So when the most critical answer to that is the third bullet point, when the handling of the special case is to do nothing. If that's not true, and you need to do something like raise an error, the null object pattern is probably not for you in that particular case, because it's important for you to. Now, if most of the time you want to do nothing, and in some cases, then you need to do something special and raise an error, then you could argue that go ahead and use a null object, and then in that special case, interrogate the null object to see if it's a null object, and then raise the exception. So I've seen that a couple of places where most of the time it's okay to just use it, but in critical spots, you need to check, hey, do I have something real, and throw an exception otherwise.
Cool.
But the do nothing is the important part. And I break that rule slightly on here because I wanted the library to be useful, and that is it does nothing like things, but it's not specifically nothing. So it enables it to act more like an active record object than a pure null object in here. And that's what makes it somewhat useful. Yeah.
How do these null objects compare when you test them for equality?
Well, object equality, they'll be different. However, there is an option, not gives you an option that you can turn on Singleton Mode, because technically you only ever need one of them. And if you do that, then they would have object equality. Any other type of equality, it would do the same kind of, if you haven't defined a comparable method on there, then it's going to use object equality and they're not going to be equal. If you typically would say, determine if two of your models are equal by checking, say, are their IDs the same, then your null object is going to be the same as another null object because both IDs will be nil. If you ask it versus, if that's how you're comparing, that may not be the best comparison, but I'm just tossing that out there. It's up to, a standard model has got to know how to compare itself to another one. So.
Do you have a number of situations where you are checking two active record instances for equality at the object level?
No, it was just a random thought that I had.
Yeah.
Because I think that, this is a case where not has a behavior and ActiveNull has a behavior, but ActiveNull doesn't try and change not's behavior here.
No.
And so, but it also doesn't implement the comparable from active record base.
No.
Right. So it wouldn't behave like an active record object if you were doing a spatial operation.
Well, actually, because it grabs everything that's on the original, which is comparable,
okay.
then what would happen is you'd actually get nil, which would say you're trying to compare a null object with, so if you compared a null post with a post, you'd get an exception thrown saying you're trying to, you can't compare a null object. So if you had an array of them, and like several of the things in the array might be null objects, and you tried to sort them, you'd get an exception thrown saying you can't compare a null post to a post. Because, now, we could change that behavior by actually adding a comparable in that always returns false. And then that way, because the way comparable works, it either returns true, false, or nil. If it's nil, it's an incompatible type, you can't compare. If it's true or false, then, well, actually, it's
Zero,
zero,
one,
zero, -1, 0, or 1. So we'd always return, I guess it'd be safest to return, actually, I don't know what we'd return. Nil is the safest thing we
Nil
do
is
now.
the same thing.
Yeah.
I think we could make a case for always returning -1 because it would always technically be lower, but
Yeah. I think nil is the safest thing, which is what it does now. So you get an exception thrown that you can't compare them because it doesn't make sense to compare them. Yeah. Anything else out there?
Well, when you say your method might receive a nil, are you specifically talking about a method that has an argument that might be nil, or is it just?
Yeah. So if you have a method, let's say you're building a class and you have a public method on there, and it expects an argument. If you feel like there's a chance that it might be nil, what you should do is go to the as far up to the source as you can to make it so that it's a null object instead of a nil getting injected in. So whether that's whatever calls your method that's utilizing your class could ensure it's sending in a null object, or it could be like I'm doing with ActiveNull. I'm pushing it, basically all the way into active record and basically saying I don't want you to spew nils out at me anymore. I want null versions of them. Now you can still get nil from active record because you can do things like say post.where blah 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 dot first. Well, there's nothing I can do about that because you're basically trying to grab the first element of something that might not have anything in it, and no amount of hand waving is going to let me fix that. Although I did just submit a pull request to the not gem because Avdi had on one of his enhancement feature list things a proxy, a null proxy that basically you could wrap around a thing, and then no matter how many things you chained, if any of them along the way returned nil, then you could get you would get a null object out instead of nil. And so what you could theoretically do when you're using active record and ActiveNull is when you did a where, you could wrap your post class in the null proxy, and the way I've implemented it is you can optionally give it a specific null object class to use, or it'll just by default use a standard null object, which is from not.build. And so you could, in this case, give it a null post class, and then you could do your where, and you could even chain multiple wheres together, and then at the end you could say dot first, and you're either going to get a null post or you're going to get the real first post off of all those queries. So if he pulls that in, then automatically if I update the version in ActiveNull, then you would have null proxy available and be able to do that. It'd be kind of slick. I might even be able to figure out a way to hack active record to automatically do that for you, but I'm not positive. The way it works is you have to explicitly at the end of it ask for the thing, because it can't work otherwise. So at the end of the chain you say dot first, but then you have to say dot. Right now it's this funky underscore object thing or whatever, but you have to ask for it because it can't know when you're done chaining, right? You can keep chaining, and chaining. So you have to somehow indicate it when you're done chaining. And so when you call that final thing that indicates the terminus of the chain, then it returns either the real thing if there is one or a null. And that'll be pretty cool when that goes in. All right. We'll let Brian start wowing us with his voting comments.